Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Monday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma, and I appreciate you being with me. All right, we are continuing our study of the Olivet Discourse. I have been spending considerable time demonstrating for us that Matthew chapter 25 is about the same subject as Matthew chapter 24, the so-called first section, that dealt with the end of the Old Covenant age in AD 70. Let me state this as simply as possible, okay? If Matthew chapter 25 is about the coming of the Lord at the end of the Old Covenant age that occurred in AD 70 with the destruction of Jerusalem, there is no futurist eschatology. I mean, people go to tremendous lengths to try to prove that Matthew chapter 24 and 25 are divided into two different subjects. About 99% of those who divide the discourse say that, well, in Matthew chapter 24, verses 4 to 35, Jesus was talking about the end of the Old Covenant age, talking about his coming in the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, typical prophetic language, typical metaphoric language. But then in verse 36, he supposedly shifts subjects and begins talking about his coming literally as a 5'5" Jewish man at the end of the church age, the end of human history. And chapter 25 is supposedly all about that yet future event. Now, a few commentators, such as Doug Wilson, believe that everything up to chapter 25, verse 31, did refer to AD 70, but supposedly in Matthew 25, 31, we've got something totally different going on, and that's the end of time. I've already discussed that, not going to go into greater detail. But what I've been sharing with you is how absolutely fundamentally important and critical it is to understand that the entirety of Matthew chapter 25 was nothing but the expectation and the prediction of the fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel. Look, folks, this is not new eschatology. I'm going to touch again on something that I've covered before, but I want to bring it back to our memory, or bring it back to our focus to demonstrate how Matthew chapter 25 is not talking about something radically different from that which goes before. For the last couple of videos, I've shared with you the incredibly rich, incredibly wonderful subject of Zion. In the Old Testament, this singular word, Zion, which represented Jerusalem, every single eschatological tenet, and by the way, this gets to the point of confirming my thesis, okay, that there are no new eschatological promises in the New Testament. They are all based upon the expectation of the imminent to them, the first century writers, fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel. Because you see, when the New Testament writers talked about the coming New Jerusalem, that's the expectation of the fulfillment of all of those Old Testament prophecies that had to do with Old Covenant Israel and her salvation. That would then lead to the salvation of the nations. So in this one word, Zion/Jerusalem, when we find the New Testament writers saying that the Jerusalem that is above is the mother of us all, and that the Old Covenant Jerusalem was about to be cast out with her children and the Old Covenant, and when we find the statements, we have here no abiding city, but we seek one that is about to come, Hebrews 13, verse 14, and that's Zion. And when we have John seeing the 144,000 standing on Mount Zion to celebrate the Feast of Sukkot, the resurrection feast, that was about to come quickly, shortly, at hand, soon. And when we have the Hebrews writer saying, to return to Hebrews, you have come to Mount Zion. Look, folks, when we realize, once again, that every constituent element of eschatology, every single constituent element, kingdom, salvation, righteousness, resurrection, the wedding. Let me reiterate a point. Resurrection. When we realize that every single one of those eschatological tenets that the New Testament writes about and says they were waiting for the coming of the New Jerusalem to come down from God out of heaven. Well, when would that take place? Oh, time of the resurrection, Revelation chapter 20, 10 and following. This interrelationship between Zion and eschatology simply cannot be overlooked. So this morning, let's explore that just a little bit, as I've already suggested, to go back over some territory that we've already covered, but it's absolutely essential for the discussion, not only of eschatology, not only for the unity of the Olivet Discourse, but for the subject of the resurrection, the coming of the Lord, the judgment, the rewarding. Okay? And that's the subject of the wedding. Now, last week, we covered Isaiah chapter 62. Well, you see, Isaiah 62 is somewhat parallel to the book of Hosea. But in Isaiah chapter 62, the Lord promised that at the coming of the Lord, the wedding would take place. Now, this is the restoration, the diorthosis of Zion. Here's what's critical about this. You see, the promise of the return or the restoration, the reformation of Zion is the promise of the restoration of all 12 tribes. The prediction of the restoration of the 10 northern tribes, ladies and gentlemen, was not distinctively related to the promise of the restoration of Zion, Jerusalem. Why? Well, because when the 10 northern tribes went off into captivity, guess what? Jerusalem wasn't. So the 10 northern tribes went into captivity. The restoration of the 10 tribes is not the promise independently of the promise of the restoration of Judah and Jerusalem, Zion. But when we find the promise of the restoration of Zion, that is the promise of the restoration of all 12 tribes. That's why it's so eschatological. Ezekiel 37, the resurrection, all 12 tribes. So in God, in Isaiah 62, notice what he does. This is incredible. He talks about the glorification and the restoration of Zion at the time of the wedding. Well, wait a minute. According to Hosea 5 and 6, according to Hosea chapter 3, according to Hosea chapter 2, 19 to 23, the restoration of Israel, the 10 northern tribes, would be at the time of the wedding. You have that? Because God divorced the 10 northern tribes. Hosea chapter 2, 1 and following, write them a bill of divorcement. I am not your husband, you are not my wife. Speaking to the 10 northern tribes. Okay, so God divorced the 10 northern tribes. But when he did that, he did not divorce Judah at that time. He would divorce Judah later. He could not divorce Judah immediately because of the promise of Messiah. But when Messiah came, what would happen? Oh, the restoration of Zion. Because Zion had to be divorced, literal Zion, just like the 10 northern tribes were divorced. But when that divorce of the 10 northern tribes and the 2 southern tribes was completed, and Judah was slain just like the 10 northern tribes were slain, Hosea chapter 5, Hosea 13, then what would he do? He would raise the whole house of Israel, all 12 tribes, resurrect them from the dead, not biological death, but from sin death, alienation from God. That's what Ezekiel 37 is all about. He would recreate the whole house of Israel into the image of God's dear Son and conform them to the image of God's dear Son, creating a new man, along with the Gentiles, Ephesians chapter 2, creating one new man in Christ. So the restoration of all Israel would be joined with the calling of the Gentiles to create one new man. Folks, that is involved in the restoration of Zion, of Isaiah chapter 62. Isaiah 62, therefore, is the promise of the complete restoration of Israel, i.e. the righteous remnant of both houses, not all of them. And when people want to talk about, God's going to save all Israel, it was always, invariably, the righteous remnant, never the totality of the corporate body. The righteous remnant, which, once again, would join with the Gentiles to create one new man, to create, a nation, as Isaiah chapter 66 says. So I hope you can see that in this promise of Zion that I discussed last week a good bit, I hope you can see how significant it is when the New Testament writers tell us that they were anticipating the arrival of Zion. And it was coming very soon. And it was coming when the old Zion was going to be destroyed. That's exactly like the Old Testament predicted it. Now then, as I suggested at the very outset, I want to cover tomorrow, on the flip side, I want to look at this concept of the wedding as it relates to Zion and as it relates to the New Testament teaching about when that wedding would take place, when that wedding banquet would take place. In the meantime, look, folks, we're halfway done with the month. Don't fail to take advantage because, look, in both these books, I developed this concept of the wedding and of the banquet and of Zion, okay? My book, The Resurrection of Daniel, chapter 12, verse 2, fulfilled or future, and we shall meet him in the air, the wedding. Might that suggest something to us? The wedding of the King of Kings. Now, in this book particularly, I discuss all of this information from Hosea that I've just ever so briefly touched on this morning. There's an in-depth discussion of Hosea that discusses the divorce, the departure, and the death of the 10 northern tribes, but the promise of the restoration, the remarriage, and the resurrection of Israel. Now, if you purchase each one of these books separately, independently, and paid separate shipping, you'd pay $59, $57, $59. But for the month of May 2023, U.S. orders only, total delivered price, $39.95. Go to my website, donkpreston.com, BibleProphecy.com, click on the link, order the books. Like I said, you'll be really glad you did. Okay, got more on this concept of Zion and the wedding on the flip side. I'll see you there.